Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. American Sniper is the astonishing autobiography of SEAL Chief Chris Kyle, who is the record holder for most kills for a sniper in U.S. military history. Kyle has more than 150 officially confirmed kills. The previous American record was 109. Though his remarkable career total has not been made official by the Pentagon. In this New York Times bestselling memoir, Kyle shares the true story of his extraordinary decade-long career, including his multiple combat tours in Iraq, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and elsewhere from 1999 to 2009. Kyle's riveting first-person account of how he went from Texas rodeo cowboy to expert marksman and feared assassin offers a fascinating view of modern-day warfare and one of the most in-depth and illuminating looks into the secret world of special ops ever written. The book that we're featuring this evening is American Sniper, the autobiography of the most lethal sniper in U.S. military history, with my special guest, author Jim DeFelice. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, Jim DeFelice.
Thanks a lot, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. This is quite a unique book, even for this program where we have our share of unique books. This is a fascinating memoir of a pretty fascinating guy. So congratulations. First off, give us a little bit of your background, Jim, because it's very interesting to know how you came to this story, and tell us really how you came to be able to be the author of this American Sniper, why you wanted to do it, how you came to be involved with this. Tell us a little bit about your background and that story, how you came to write American Sniper.
Well, even though I'm primarily known as a novelist, I have actually done a number of nonfiction books and helped a couple of celebrities write their memoirs. Until American Sniper, though, I had never helped a military person actually write a memoir, but I was very interested in getting that opportunity. And it happened that the publisher, my publishers, HarperCollins, was interested in, had heard about Chris, and approached Chris about doing a book. And when he indicated that he was interested, they contacted me and said, "Hey, we know that you've been looking for, we know you've been looking for a really good topic, a really good subject. Would you be interested in, talking to the SEAL?" At the time, they didn't really know all that much about Chris, and they knew that he had the record, or was talked about as having the record of kills, but they didn't really know all that much about him. So they gave his lawyer my phone number, and Chris and I had a conversation on the phone, and I still remember it because I said, "Chris, why do you want to tell your story? Why do you want to write a book?" And he said, "I want to honor the people I served with, and I want to help the families of the two guys who I couldn't save." And I said, "You know what? That's a hell of a good reason to write a book.
Yeah,
it's a really good reason to write a book." And
sure.
I think from that moment on, I was hooked, and I would have, I knew it was going to be a great book.
Now, give us a little bit of the background here. We're talking about Texas here in terms of where he was born and raised, and just for the record too, where are you originally from, and how much connection do you have to sort of this kind of the lifestyle that he, or the upbringing that he had in Texas itself? But tell us then about a little bit about where he grew up specifically in Texas.
Sure, and it's kind of an amazing thing because I don't know how much my accent gives me away, but I'm a New York City born and bred fellow. We live outside of the city. And Chris was a good old boy. Chris was Texas born and bred and raised, and except while he was in the Navy and SEAL, had lived all his life in Texas, and still had quite a lot of the Texas twang in him, and went to the lengths, just to kind of preserve that heritage. He had two kids, and when one of them was born, he happened to be stationed out in California, and that's where obviously they had the children. But he had his father ship him a little box of Texas dirt, so that when each one of his children was born, the first thing that their feet stepped on was Texas dirt, and so he was very much a Texas character. In high school, he started riding rodeo. He went through a lot of different events, and eventually got pretty good at busting broncos, and won a whole bunch of belts, which is kind of the prize that you win when you're
right
on the circuit. And he couldn't survive on that for a long time, but it kept him in beer money through the first couple of years in college. And eventually he when he got out of college, he became a cowboy, and he loved it. He loved the life. He just loved it to death. But you can't get rich. You can't get rich being a cowboy. Yeah. And eventually he decided he wanted to do something else, and he'd actually always wanted to be a Marine. And so he went one day to the recruiting office, and the Marine recruiter happened to be out for lunch. And he was, kind of went to the door was closed, realized the guy was out for lunch, and, made a U-turn. Was on his way out of the building, and he heard a voice say, hey, boy, son, come here, come over here. So what are you doing? What are you trying to sign up for? And Chris told him I want to be a Marine, and he told him why. And the recruiter said, well, I'm with the Navy. You ever hear of the SEALs? And from that little short, brief conversation, a whole career was born.
Tell us a little bit about the relationship that he had with his family growing up, or what kind of family life he really had. And initially he had, like a lot of people in Texas and a lot of people in general have hunting in terms of an experience when they're young. How important was hunting, and how important was hunting with the family that he grew up with in Texas?
Yeah, I think that was, just as you say, that was, a really a formative experience for him. He and his dad, at a very early age, his dad took him out to learn how to hunt. Showed him, and Chris has a younger brother, a few years younger. Both of them, were taught from a very early age to respect guns, to respect hunting. They would not. Basically, they would eat anything they killed. So, whether it was when they were little, if they got a squirrel, they'd have squirrel stew. More often, as they got a little older, hunting deer and other sorts of animals. Chris was a fairly decent shot from a young age, but not necessarily, a champion. But he grew up around guns and and just the outdoor life, and he really liked those. He liked the life, and he liked the skills that he developed as a young man.
When was he born? What year was he born?
Boy, I'd actually, off the top of my head, I can't remember. I have to look it up.
Well, we'll say roughly so that I can set up this question.
He was born roughly in the 70s. He was still a young man when he died. So you got me, Dan. So
Oh no. No, I just want to have a context because we're going to be talking about Iraq, but we're also going to be talking about, obviously, the question I want to ask was, growing up and with his family's background, was there any military background? And in terms of a teenager having an attitude, and certainly Chris had one, what was his earliest opinion about war?
I think that Chris wasn't particularly philosophical about a lot of things. He was very patriotic. He very much believed in America, and he also, one thing that was very important for him growing up was to stand up for other people. He was the epitome of the older brother. His younger brother was, I think, 3 or 4 years younger than him, and there's a lot of stories, among not only Chris but among Chris's brother's friends about how Chris had stood up for younger kids and smaller kids who were being picked on. So he really had kind of that protective gene almost in him when he was a kid. I think that when he got into the reason that he got into the military was a combination of patriotism and also adventure. I think, like a lot of young men, he not only wanted to serve his country, but he also wanted to kind of put himself in kind of an action type situation and test himself in different ways. And being a SEAL was in a lot of ways the ultimate test for a young man, especially one that is not only patriotic but is kind of thinks of themselves as kind of a tough fighter or that kind of person.
Right. Now, tell us where Taya fits in here in terms of timeline. In terms of when did he meet? And is that the way I pronounce it, Taya? Or
yeah, Taya. Yeah, absolutely. Taya is his wife, and actually, they met in the 90s when, shortly after Chris had qualified to become a SEAL and he was still though in his training. SEALs have a kind of, we think of a SEAL as someone who has passed the basic requirements and BUDS and gone through the regular courses and now they're become a SEAL. Well, to the SEALs, that's just kind of the first. That's kind of the first rung. You now have to go through all this training and prove yourself before the other people in the teams will really accept you as a SEAL. And Chris was in that stage where he had passed through kind of all the preliminaries, and the world called him a SEAL, but he was still trying to prove himself to the teams or to the SEALs themselves. And they were in. Chris was in San Diego, and Taya one night came down with a friend and met him, or was hanging out in a bar, and basically, depending on which one of them is telling the story, either she picked him up or he picked her up, and they started joking and drinking and joking. And Taya, according to Taya, at the end of the night, she had drunk so much, unfortunately, she threw up, and when he still called her I think it was the next day, when he still called her, she knew that it must be true love.
Sure. Yeah, interesting, yeah. So she was obviously understanding how passionate he was about the military and especially or specifically the SEALs as well. And did she understand, or did he explain, or did she somehow have some military history herself within her family? How did she come to accept everything that she felt she needed to accept in partnering up with Chris Kyle?
I think it was a process and a long process. I don't think that, first of all, I don't think that anyone completely understands what it means to deploy into a combat situation if you're the soldier of that, that's going there before you've actually done it, or B, the spouse or the kids, of that family. It's one thing to read a book about it or see a movie about it or even hear somebody that's been there, and quite another thing to actually emotionally experience it. And at the point when they met, not only had neither Chris nor Taya had deployment or been through a deployment, and I think that Chris was still learning what it meant to be a SEAL, and Taya was, at that point anyway, learning what it meant to be in love with a SEAL. And I think it was like a long process. It wasn't necessarily a smooth road. We talk a lot about the kind of some of the trials and tribulations they went through, through it in the book.
Now, with this, what is the timeline in terms of the Iraq War and the spring of 2003, and the initiative by the United States and Taya and their firstborn, so we can get sort of an idea.
Yeah, Chris and Taya, meet, and their relationship starts getting hot and heavy right before 9/11. As a matter of fact, on the morning of 9/11, they wake up and they find that the towers have been struck. And Chris, we have a funny story in the book. Chris basically races to his base to report to the base, gets pulled over by one of the local policemen, who, and Chris, being Chris, was always, no matter what the situation was, no matter how much stress he was always respectful, even to cops. And the police officer came up, and Chris said, "Officer, I know you got to give me a ticket. Go ahead, give me the ticket, but I got to get to the base." And the cop looked in the back and saw his gear and realized he was military. And so the cop said, "Well, what's your unit?" And Chris said he was a SEAL. And the cop said, "All right, follow me." The cop gave him an escort. Not quite as fast as Chris had been going to the base, but it went pretty fast. As it happened, Chris was not actually needed to go to Afghanistan after 9/11, but he started training up to go to Iraq as the build-up for Iraq happened. Chris and Taya married in that same time period. And they actually have as it worked out, both of their children right before deployments that Chris went on, which I'm sure was extremely stressful for both of them, but especially for Taya. She was left the first time. She was a first-time mother with a newborn. And her husband suddenly, her husband was there one day, and then the next day was, off on the other side of the world, being shot at. So it was an extremely stressful experience. An experience I should note that, the wives, and loved ones of service people, of literally hundreds of thousands of service people have gone through. It's just that we don't necessarily think about that side of the equation sometimes.
Now, you talk about the son being born just as he's being deployed to Iraq. Is that correct? Or
yes.
Afghanistan?
No, Iraq. Actually, it's Iraq. All the deployments in the book are in Iraq.
Okay. Now, with with his deployment, now how we've kind of skipped over some real important stuff. Number one, I certainly don't know, but our audience certainly doesn't know about what really a SEAL means in terms of what is their purpose in the military. You know, it's secretive, but tell us a little bit about the SEALs and how does he rise to the level that he is one of these, again, assassins, he's a sniper. How does that happen? You said he wasn't really a marksman when he was young. How does he get to this point? And
sure.
and how does he? Why do they pick him?
Sure. Let's just hit on like kind of a common misconception first. A lot of people, when we use the word sniper, a lot of people think of kind of a person stalking a high-value target, so to speak, for days and days and days. And while that certainly is occasionally done in contemporary military, the role of snipers on the battlefield has evolved as everything else has evolved. And in the American military, and actually in pretty much most Western, I'll make a blanket statement and say every other Western military. I may possibly be missing somebody, but most militaries use snipers or really good marksmen in situations where they need to be able to not kill civilians, and they need precision. They want to have precision shots where there's potentially people around who may get hurt, and so the ability and the equipment to be able to to strike a combatant or an enemy at 1,000 yards becomes kind of a premium in a war, especially in a place like Iraq, where all of the time you had civilians all over the place. So it's kind of a misconception, and I think that that I certainly shared it, beforehand, not really knowing anything about the contemporary tactics and strategies. And the word sniper, sounds really cool, but the odd thing is that it comes out of a whole movement to reduce collateral damage and injuries. What happened with Chris? The SEALs in American military, the SEALs are an elite special operations unit they're trained to operate on the sea, in the air, and on the land, which is where that nickname SEALs comes from. There are a number of teams. They're assigned from different places, and you can think of them as the kind of the Navy equivalent to other special operations units like the American Special Forces or Rangers or the Air Commandos. They each have a slightly different mission and somewhat different training, but they're all kind of elite units. In Iraq, the SEALs were used initially in the initial invasion, and Chris was part of this, to seize oil fields that they were afraid that Saddam would blow up and pollute the Gulf with, as he had done in the first Gulf War. So Chris and the SEAL team that he was part of were assigned just at the very start of the ground war to go in and take over an oil terminal and basically protect it from an ecological disaster. And that was really his first initiation. He was a young man and kind of the young man on the low guy on the totem pole, for want of a better metaphor. And even though he was in an elite unit and had proven himself, one of the best soldiers around, he still had to prove himself to that team. He was a quote unquote new guy, and that was kind of his first introduction into combat there. And he served in Iraq for I forget exactly how long the deployment is. They're actually only in combat for a few months. And then when he came back, he had proven himself to the point where he was recommended for sniper school. And, from there he was trained, to be a sniper. Marksmanship is absolutely critical and important. And Chris, I have to tell you, Chris was a hell of a shot, although he always claimed that he wasn't. He always said he was just a good shot. I've shot with him. He was an incredible shot, believe me. But I guess I take his word for it that there were guys that were better. But he was, besides being a really, really good shot on the rifle, he was extremely patient, and he had the sort of skills that are necessary for snipers today, and that includes being able to go out in the field, to be able to scout different areas, but also to anticipate where an enemy would be making an attack. Again, as I was saying before, we think of snipers as people in the jungles. Well, in Iraq, much of the action, probably 90% of the action that the snipers saw, were in urban situations. And the snipers who were in Iraq had to, learn to interpret, kind of urban areas and where the enemy would be coming from.
Now, you say you're not quite, a few months is a typical deployment.
It's about
his son is born.
Months, but,
His son is born, and he doesn't really get a chance to bond with his son, obviously, despite photos and, I guess, knowing, getting contact with his wife constantly with Taya. Tell us what his adjustment was like when he'd come back from the deployment.
I think it's pretty tough. It's tough. I think one of the weirdest things about modern combat is that you're in a combat situation. On Thursday, people are shooting at you, and on Saturday you're driving down the street of wherever it is you live, San Diego or wherever, and you're going home, and that's got to be a heck of a. I've never had to make that transition myself, but I would imagine it's very, very strange. Chris would typically spend a couple of weeks, really, kind of decompressing, and for him that basically meant staying in the house and just kind of, just not seeing anybody or seeing very few people. And just getting used to not being shot at. The SEALs, everybody that was in Iraq obviously was to some degree or another in danger. The SEALs' mission typically was to go out and find the people who were planning bombs, planning IEDs, who were carrying out assassinations, generally against Iraqis, and so they were always in danger. So I think it was like kind of jumping off a freight train that's moving at 110 miles an hour, and now you have to learn to walk again.
How is his marriage faring from the deployment itself and then the adjustment itself?
Yeah, well, it was up and down. It's a huge amount of stress. Having a kid is is a huge amount of stress. Period. Sure. But throw a war in there and and everything else, and it's incredible. They went up and down at times. At times, in their words, it was blissful, and then at other times, they were. I think both of them were ready to to throw in the towel. We talk about we one of the most emotional things for me in working on the book was very early on when we were working. Chris, I remember we conducted a lot of the interviews. We did a lot of interviews in person, obviously, and we spent a lot of time together. Chris and Tay came up and stayed with with myself and my family up here, and I went down and stayed with them. And I think the first time that we really spent a lot of time together, we actually were at a ranch, and it was a friend of Chris's and now a friend of mine. And I just remember, I think it was the first breakfast we had. We were sitting around, and Taya, who's a great cook, by the way, had made us breakfast, and we just started talking, and they started talking about their marriage, and they were talking for some reason about some hard times they had, and it was just an incredibly emotional experience to hear these people just pouring, saying, how difficult it had been for them to stay together, and Taya talking about the struggles that she had, and and Chris talking about how difficult it had been for him to adjust to coming back to America. And the one time that stands out, and we go into a lot of detail about this in the book, in American Sniper, but one time that stands out for me, their son was growing, and Taya just came to the conclusion that he was really going to need, he needed a strong male figure, growing up, and she told Chris that, because his enlistment was coming up, that if he was going to re-enlist, she wasn't going to leave the marriage, she wasn't going to walk out, but she was going to move from their home in San Diego up to be with her parents, to be closer to her parents, because this way, at least, that their son, would have their grandfather as a male figure. And I think that was a really important moment for Chris. I think that Chris realized that that he had to make a decision that while he wasn't necessarily going to lose his wife and family, I think that inside he realized that he had to decide between the job that he had always wanted and loved, and the family that he had always wanted and loved. And he chose love. He chose his kids and his wife. And I think about it some days. I'm not sure if I had the same choice, would I choose between my career and my family? I don't know. That's a tough choice for all of us, I think.
Right. Now he's working with the Polish GROM, or the NCO in Iraq, and what was interesting too is that you also talk about, well, he talks about in the memoir, and of course you make it come alive, in that what happens is that they're also providing cover for advancement and clearing of buildings. So there's a lot of that sort of activity by the SEALs as well, isn't there?
Right. Yeah. Well, first of all, I gotta say, I have to give the GROM a real plug, because they're great guys, and they owe me some drinks too. So
yeah.
hopefully they're
some vodka.
Well, I'm not going to drink any of the vodka that they drink, because their stuff is just crazy. Those guys. I'm not going to. Chris couldn't keep up with them in drinking, so I'm not going to even try. But they were actually, Chris and Taya went over. I couldn't make it, but Chris and Taya went over when the book came out. We've been translated into many different languages, and the Poles, the GROM especially, were exceptional hosts. And I worked very closely with the Polish translator, who was really an excellent guy. And so I can't say enough about how hospitable those people they were. But yes, the job that and we should explain, the GROM are the Polish kind of the Polish equivalent of SEALs. They're in a very elite special forces unit, and like the SEALs, what they were often assigned to do would be to find whether he's a bomb maker or someone who was suspected of being a terrorist leader. They would go to his house and make the arrest and bring him in. Sometimes it went off without a hitch. They would come there in the middle of the night, knock on the door, and door would open. They'd say, are you such and so? Or actually, the interpreter would say, are you such and such? And I'd say yes. Okay, well, you have to come with us. Blah blah blah, and there'd be no problem. More often, the door would be locked, and and you didn't really know what was going to happen, inside. And that was Chris. Chris went on quite a number of those missions, basically because he had been trained. Besides training as a sniper, he had trained as a navigator and was able to handle the special equipment that the Grom needed to use to get around wherever they were at the time.
Now, he goes for, this is 4 deployments, but it's interesting what happens between the 3rd and the 4th deployment in terms of the, I believe it's the other child, and
right.
Tell us a little bit about the leukemia scare.
Well, when Chris's daughter was born, there are a number of ailments, and without going into all the technicalities, unfortunately, that she had to be hospitalized, and the initial sets of reports looked very, very bad. So much so that I think that without going too deep into their kind of personal lives here, but I think that Taya probably thought that she was, with good reason, that her daughter was going to die, and it looked like she had leukemia and other complications. At the same time, Chris had been under quite a lot of stress and strain, on the job, and I think he got, when he learned that his daughter was suffering with leukemia, and that the doctors at that point were saying the prognosis did not look very good. He went to his CO and said, basically explained what was going on, and the CO, to his credit, just arranged very quickly with the help, I believe, of the Red Cross, just to get Chris home, and he was home within he was on his way within hours. I forget whether it took 24 or 36 hours for him to get there. Fortunately, and thank God, her condition was difficult, but it was not anywhere near as dire as some of the tests had initially showed. And they were able to, I don't know all the medications and stuff, but they were able to deal with the problem, and it turned out she didn't have leukemia, that test had been incorrect, and fortunately, and so she, thank God, today is a really, really healthy, great little kid.
Now, you mentioned God, and this is another part that's interesting to, as the complexity of Chris Kyle,
sure.
is that he was what he would categorize as a devout Christian. Tell us a little bit how he came to terms with what some people might see a conflict of shooting people and a strong Christian background. How did he come to terms with that?
Sure.
How did he explain that, rationalize that?
I think that the first thing to understand about that with Chris is to understand that for Chris, what his job as a soldier was to protect his people, and by his people, he was protecting not only the people on his team, his fellow SEALs, but in his case specifically, he was protecting Iraqi civilians, and he did not see a conflict in killing the enemy. The things that he lamented, the deep sorrow that he had after the war, were for the people that he couldn't protect. The 2 men who served, next to him, who died, one during the war and one from wounds later on, and different Americans who not through any literal fault of his, but died in combat or died because of IEDs that were placed or what have you. Chris incidentally did have Muslim friends. As a matter of fact, I've just finished a book on one of the men who was a really good friend of Chris, who is a Muslim, a Sunni Muslim. But in terms of religion, Chris considered himself, as you say, a devout Christian. He had been brought up as a Christian. His father had been, I believe, a deacon in the church, a lay deacon, and he believed in the Bible. Chris would have been the first to tell you that he committed a lot of sins in there, and but he did not see, he didn't see a big conflict with war, and I think historically that has been something that religions, especially the Christian religion, whether you're Catholic or Protestant, have dealt with over and over again over the ages. What is the just war? When should someone defend other people? When should he or she fight? And Chris wasn't particularly philosophical, and I think it was a fairly black and white question for him. His values were God, country, and family, and if his country needed him to go to war, then he was ready to go to war.
There is a story, though, that really shows how passionate he was as opposed to, well, not opposed to, but let's say compared to even fellow SEAL members. If I have this guy's name right, Dick Couch, former Vietnam guy. Now, there was so just to illustrate part of the book I found very fascinating was this little conversation that he has while Dick is doing this.
Dick's a great guy.
Tell me that story.
Dick's a great guy, and Chris had his own take. Dick, as you point out, is a SEAL and a veteran and a very good writer. It happened that he was working on a book and had a discussion. I guess got into a discussion with some other SEALs, and Chris thought that Chris had a different opinion, I think, than Dick on things, and kind of let him know about it. But I don't think either man, that was necessarily a really big moment in their lives. So.
Well, it was just that he's very passionate about if somebody was, Dick was criticizing what they were doing in Iraq as opposed to, not that he was defending Vietnam, but he was saying that they were wrong-headed in this, and Chris took it very personal.
I think to kind of to step back just a little bit, I think a lot of the older, there's a lot of the older generation, SEALs especially, but a lot of Vietnam veterans and stuff have kind of a certain idea of how the SEALs should be deployed and what sort of mission they should be on, and where they should be used, and urban warfare and the way that the SEALs were being used in different places, it doesn't fit with that model. In the Battle of Fallujah, for instance, the SEALs were used, as long-distance snipers in urban warfare, which is absolutely not a traditional special operations role. And I think that a lot of the younger guys say this is, use us because we've been trained, we're good, and we can do this. Maybe this isn't the mission that you had planned 30 years ago or 20 years ago, but it's something that we can excel at, and they have the record to back it up. The older guys see a lot of the pitfalls of that strategy, and and they have a different take. In the case that we're talking about specifically, the Battle of Ramadi, at the time, the philosophy that was being used was kind of, and unfortunately I'm going to end up taking sides by talking about it here, but the philosophy that was being used was kind of give them candy approach, and make nice, and then you can build the country. And Chris didn't believe in that. Chris's from Chris's point of view, the only reason that the terrorists lost in Ramadi, and they did, was because not just SEALs, but the American forces went after the bad guys and beat them in a very, very fierce battles. And the discussion that specifically you're referencing there has to do with that approach, and which approach you should take. And I think Chris was pretty forceful in his opinions, as he always was. So we'll have to let people read the book so they can make their own judgments.
Yeah, he did say something to the effect too that was certain factors that only could appreciate that kind of approach. There was no, again, being nice with approach. They really only, because there was certain factions that could go either way. They were looking for, not in terms of leadership, but who was going to come out on top.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously I have an opinion here, and my opinion, shades a lot. If there's two extremes, Chris is on one side, and I don't necessarily know that. I read Dick's book. Dick's book on the Battle of Ramadi is excellent. I would highly recommend it to anyone. And say it's a must read. I think my conception, though, of why that battle was won is a heck of a lot closer to Chris's. Than at least what some of the people in Dick's book say. But of course, history it's really for history to tell us in years gone by, or years to come rather. Excuse me.
Now the Taya and Chris, their marriage survives. They have 2 children. Tell us about the last deployment and then the return back from duty.
Yeah, the last deployment was, it's funny because in some ways by that time Chris had literally become a legend, and some of his buddies had started using that as a nickname as his fame started growing. But really by his 4th deployment in Iraq, or the 4th deployment that we talk about, he was truly a legend, and we say he had over 150 kills, and by that we mean confirmed kills that were recorded and done on the gun. And the reality is that he had actually, if you threw another 100 on top of that number, you still would be under how many he had. And people knew he was good. He was highly respected, and and looked up to, and the guy that you wanted in battle. On the other hand, he was also starting to get under a lot of pressure because what they call the tempo of the operations had increased so dramatically as they were fighting, and they started getting into situations where where they were getting shot at quite a lot every night, and the pressure just started, I think, just started building up. And at the same time, unfortunately, sometimes when you're in when you're in a situation like that, you don't necessarily take the best care of your body. You don't necessarily eat right. If you have habits of, say like chewing a lot of tobacco, you may start chewing a lot of tobacco and drinking a lot of coffee, and all of a sudden your heart rate starts getting way up there. And so you have all these physical things going on and stresses. And they eventually got to the point with Chris where his blood pressure and his heart rate were well beyond the normal limits. And he was eventually requested to, or was requested to go. He leaves early, about a week early. They weren't actually in combat at the time, but it was clear that that the stress was was getting to him physically, and so he goes home and stops chewing so much tobacco, among other things, and swallowing. He had a really bad habit of when you chew. I don't know if you're a tobacco chewer, but in theory you're supposed to spit it out. Well, Chris didn't. Yeah. Chris never spit his chewing tobacco out, so he would go through these big wads of. He's basically eating, tons of tobacco every day. It's like, and you're wondering why your blood pressure is up. It's like, forget the stress. It's like,
that's amazing. Now, what point does he author I thought this was impressive. He's authored the Naval Special Warfare Sniper Doctrine, and which is, you say, is the first Navy SEAL sniper manual. When did he get around to doing that?
Yeah, well, the one thing we should note, I guess, like from a historical point of view, is that until very recently, and actually until just before Chris became a sniper, the SEALs used the Marine, the Marine Sniper School exclusively, and they changed that because they wanted to emphasize a few things differently. But a lot of SEAL sniper doctrine can be traced from the Marines. And if you talk to some of the older snipers, they all went to Marine school. Like Craig Sawyer from Top Gun, he was a SEAL sniper, but he was trained by the Marines. So and that's why there was no official so they were using all the Marine documents and stuff. Chris did that. Chris put that together after he came back from that deployment, from the 4th deployment. And it's basically a manual. To my knowledge, it's obviously the specifics are still top secret, but to my knowledge, they still use pretty much what he laid out for them.
And I'm not sure we mentioned it already, but worth mentioning again, he won 2 Silver Stars, 5 bronze medals, and 1 Navy and Marine commendation. So it's not that that's what he was there for. He was.
You know where those medals? I'll tell you something. You know where those medals were? Actually, his wife put 1 or 2 of them up on the wall, but most of them were in I'm not kidding, a shoe. I honest to God, there was a shoebox at the bottom of his desk.
Yeah.
I mean.
He said he wasn't really too interested in them and showing them off, and.
No, you had to dig through the rubble there. Now, of course, you ask him about some stupid poster or not poster, but program from a Dallas Cowboy game, and you could find that real fast. So he was a big Dallas Cowboy fan, and being a New York Giant fan, I love to rib him and ride him about that.
Now, when did this book come out, Jim? When was this book released?
The hardcover edition first came out in January 2012. And the ebook came out then too. The foreign edition started coming out soon after. We had a paperback at the beginning of this year, and then just a few weeks ago we came out with a new edition, Chris Kyle Memorial Edition. Unfortunately, tragically, Chris and a neighbor and good friend of his, Chad Littlefield, were tragically murdered by a man, or it's alleged that they were murdered by a man back in February. It was immediately after Chris's death. There was a tremendous, just outcry of, just people who, just of respect for Chris. And in the Memorial Edition, myself and Taya, we talked to a lot of Chris's friends to try to get some of the other side for Chris. The book has a lot of, Chris as a warrior, obviously, and it has a lot of stuff about his marriage, but that was really only, a small part of who Chris Kyle was. And so we wanted to talk to friends of his whom he'd helped, and everybody from people on the football, baseball teams that he helped coach, all up to to blinded, to wounded, veterans whom he had helped.
Now, was he able to see the book, and how much did he appreciate it or enjoy the interviews, the subsequent interviews? Did that happen for him?
When the first book came out, I think that, it was kind of a wild process for him. When he and I were talking, it was the first time he had really ever, talked about his experiences and put them, into any sort of perspective. And I think it was very emotional. And when the book came out, he kind of had to do that all again. And I think it got easier as time went on. But when it first came out, there was so much hoopla about who he was. People calling him hero, and that was a word he didn't particularly like, especially when it was used for him. Whether he was, even though he deserved it, he didn't like to hear it used. But I think there was a lot of stress for him, and gradually, he was coming back to a good place, where he was able to use some of, or starting to use some of his fame to actually help people, and was in the process of setting up what will become a foundation to help wounded warriors, transition back into society, and also hopefully help marriages of servicemen who just to help their marriages continue and thrive despite the stress of war.
And what does Taya say from all of this? Obviously we'll have to get the newest and latest edition to hear some of her other thoughts, but overall, what was her impression of this? She loved this man, stayed with this man. Was it all worth it for her to be able to go through all this?
I think I think we all. I'm sure that we would all, want Chris back. There's no question about that. I think that, she's a remarkably strong woman, and she's done a lot of things since Chris died. There were a number of speaking commitments that Chris had that she's fulfilled. Chris had been working on another book that unfortunately I wasn't available to originally anyway to do the book, but Chris and another writer were working on American Gun, and Chris's part actually hadn't been finished at all when he died. And Taya called me, and she and I took over what Chris would have done, and kind of got that book out. Taya's also started that foundation that I was talking about, Chris Kyle Frog, and she's just done a remarkable thing, just kind of carrying on his legacy, and at the same time, raising two small kids. So, so it's pretty incredible. I would say that they were matched pretty well to two really remarkable people, and really, really, proud to call both of them my friends.
And was there anything profound that you've learned by the end of this entire project, helping this family get this story out? And of course, now we just talked about him being deceased, so it's very bittersweet. Is there anything profound that you learned from this, from the study of this incredible man and this incredible life and incredible career?
Well, I think I'm still, to be honest, I think I'm kind of still processing it in a way. I think that there's a lot of things that you can kind of roll out and say, and I think the remarkable thing I think about Chris was that if there's a lesson to be drawn, that anybody can actually end up doing heroic things if they just work hard at it. Because I don't think that, as I say, Chris was a good shot to begin with, but he wasn't the best. He just worked at it. Chris wasn't necessarily the greatest helper in the world, and yet he helped so many people just because he just did it, and he just showed up, and that was who he was. On the day of Hurricane Sandy, which wasn't really all that bad specifically where I live, he called me up at 5 o'clock in the morning and asked me, he texted me at 5 in the morning and asked if I needed help, and was like, "Go to bed, dude. I'm good up here." So, I mean, there's lots of lessons like that, and it's hard to kind of just draw one out and say, that. I mean, the oldest. I guess the biggest cliche in the world is that you don't know what you've got until they're gone, and just value those friendships, while you have them. We were digging around for photos in the memorial edition, as we wanted to put photos in, and there's no photo of Chris and I together, which is it's kind of funny and ironic, and it's like, no, we never, I never took no. I don't believe in taking pictures. We just do stuff, and now I kind of wish I had a photo, but that's the way it goes. So.
Yeah, well, he's an interesting and fascinating character. He's his entire attitude's just totally uncompromising. He does have this incredible love for his country, his family, his friends. He's no saint, that's for sure. He's he's like a little guy, like he's a teenager that almost didn't grow up sometimes, but he's mischievous. But in the end, he's a hero. He's a guy that wants to protect people and has the guts and the gumption to do it. And he really loved the military. He like I say, he's uncompromising and unflinching in what he said. He said, "I enjoy doing this. And don't get me wrong," he says, "there's like no nightmares." So it's a fascinating story of love for a person that really maybe didn't want to show it, but he was a very loving and giving and generous person, a real soft guy, but a real tough customer, and that's why he had the nickname the Devil. Translated in Iraq, that's the kind of guy he was feared by those people in Iraq because of what he was capable of doing. I want to thank you very much, Jim, for coming on and talking about American Sniper. I want to thank you very much. How can people get a hold of you if they're inclined to contact you? And do you have a webpage, website, Facebook?
The easiest way to get me is through my website, which is jimdefelice.com. There's there's a page where you can leave a message or email. You can email me at author at jimdefelice.com is probably the easiest way. There's also, I have a blog. There's an Amazon page. I tweet. If you really want weird tweets, you can follow me on Twitter, and there's a Facebook page and all that cool stuff.
Great. So I want to thank you very much, Jim, and hope to hear from you again soon with another fascinating project.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jim.
Okay.
Good night.